Welcome, noble spirits, to Sessions of Spirit number 37. This one is about the Nobel Prizes. You might have heard by this point, but you might not know why something so audacious is being said with a certain degree of confidence. I'll give you a little bit of an idea of how we got here through the first 36 Sessions of Spirit, and I'll go very quickly to do this within 2 to 3 minutes. But you can go back and find these all on YouTube if this is your first time participating. So let's go. The first session of Spirit was talking about Hegel was the greatest philosopher of all time. He's like the sum total of 100 philosophers over 3,000 years in one philosophical system. Number 2 is that nobody's ever done this before, and nobody understands to this day how he did this. Number 3 is that once you understand it, you can change the world. Number 4 is that to understand Hegel, you have to get past the stereotypes of him. And that means number 5, grasping the circle of reason, which looks a little religious at the end. But genuine philosophy is the sublation of religion, not the negation, because 7, it is the universal logic, which unites everything together. And this is where we're going to win the Nobel Peace Prize, which I'll cover soon. Number 8 is that this universal logic starts with polemics. But number 9, it finishes with sublation, which is the polemic of polemics. It's how genuine philosophers refute each other. More peaceful. Number 10 is that the master class in this kind of peaceful logic is Hegel's Science of Logic. Number 11 is that it's incredibly profound metaphysically as the unspeakable communicating itself. Number 12 is that the point of life is living this unspeakable explicit logic. To number 13, liberate literally everybody, because everybody's deserving. Number 14 is that this is the feeling of the connection of God when you do it right religiously. Number 15 is that atheistically, it just means a connection to your higher self and the release of your inner child. Number 16 is that our greatest gurus of the last 3,000 years were just doing this as the logic implicit. Number 17 is that it's very mystical at first, but we have to sublate old superstitious mysticism with scientific mysticism to grasp the real power of now. Number 18 is that the dialectical reason we have, this mystical reason, is the limit of our fun, games, and flow, because genuine philosophy is supposed to be, number 19, fun, full of laughter, not supposed to be just solemn. Number 20 is that ideal philosophers move in this way, and they sublate all the philosophers before them into an ideal harmony, which is what Hegel did. To 21, overcome evil, which really just philosophically means ignorance and one-sidedness. To 22, bring a new wisdom to our disruptive technologies like CRISPR. To 23, have this logic very concrete and practical tools like the synchronicity document of philosophies. To 24, supercharge our interpersonal dialectics in our dialogues. To 25, sublate everybody, and to give practical examples. We did that with all the religions in the world, the major ones, and then we did that the same thing in session 26 with existentialism, the opposite of religious consciousness. To 27, then do this everywhere socioeconomically with capitalism, socialism, and communism to sort of overcome the global existential crisis we're experiencing as a species. 28 is we sublated the atheistic religion, which was Buddhism. 29 is that we sublated atheism itself. 30 is we did that through ourselves and self-determination. 31 is that language is a big part of this, but it's not just us speaking language, it's also language speaking us, as Wittgenstein started to edge on. And 32 is this is how we overcome the horror of dialectic metaphysically and also within ourselves, is overcoming double binds. 33 is that to overcome double binds collectively is how we overcome colonialism and imperialism of the past and don't repeat the circle of suffering that we've seen historically. 34 is that once we overcome these double binds and this ordinary thinking, we enter the true soil of genuine philosophy by breaking out of the matrix of ordinary thought, starting with Descartes. And then 35 was that we want to start leading this new world spirit that's emerging in this genuine philosophy by grasping the right order of things properly and talking about how reason is the only difference between democracies, between bad democracies and good democracies, and also bad dictatorships and benevolent dictatorships. You can be either one as long as there's genuine reason there, which is based on our genuine universal logic. And then that brings us to last session, which is 36. Once you start embodying this in yourself, you become an agent of world history because spirit is coming through you in a kind of mystique that comes with profound clarity. You cut through the confusion, and people want to follow you because you're speaking with universals. That calls to the spirit in people. So that brings us to today. And today's session has the title, Winning 5 Nobel Prizes for the Glory of God, Self, and Genuine Philosophy. SOS here in the beginning stands for Sessions of Spirit, but it can also stand for Save Our Souls, which is just a turn of phrase saying that, genuine philosophy is supposed to be practical, not just theoretical. It's supposed to make the world better. And the Nobel Prizes is a part of this. It's about taking that knowledge and doing something in the world with it to benefit humanity. So the image here today is, of course, representing the essence of the talk. On one side, we have a famous painting by William Blake, which is his God that is supposed to be a representation of humanity approximating God knowledge. And he's kind of measuring things here. And there's a sort of fallacy to this, but there's also a profoundness to this kind of God. And then, of course, Nobel is the man who donated, I think, 200 million to encourage people to perform science for the benefit of all humanity in a sort of ideal way. And so, of course, we talked about the divine idea, the absolute idea in Hegel's philosophy, and that we're going to be doing a version of this, but of course, in the wisest way possible. All right. So today we have a summary paragraph that kind of grasps the whole of what we're going to talk about very cogently, because you can say a lot with less when you know what you're talking about. So let's get into this, and hopefully you understand some of it. It goes, if we are to return philosophy to its rightful place atop the throne of wisdom, we must do so with all the glory of our own self-determination and thrust of individual existence, but also with the full power of world spirit, of infinitely scientific God on earth through our own self-knowing. It is our destiny to know ourselves and the supreme aim of philosophy itself. In a concrete reasoning, we bridge this long-standing divide between ourselves and our innate and immanent wisdom as we externalize this knowing into new structures of freedom. We sublate the old system into the higher liberation of spirit and integrity, and do not fall trapped into the reaction of abstract negation. One such beacon of light, which stands as the implicit vanguard for what philosophy could have been since Hegel, is the pure heart and literal will of Alfred Nobel, the man who put ideality directly into the requirements of the prize process. And the quote goes like this from him. It goes, "Fourth prize for literary work in an ideal direction. Let us bring this concrete reason to the summit of recognition with all the integrity that can be mustered and unite the prizes into one ideally idealizing idea. Let us transform the prizes into the universal prizes of genuine philosophy to fuel the new systems, rights, and institutions of wisdom." Sounds simple or cogent. It's very cogent, but is it simple? Maybe not so much if you don't understand the order that is behind those words. So today's notes are going to talk about unpacking that dialectically, starting where we left off from last session. So we've been growing this message all along. And the last session was about how what makes us unforgettable in history, in art, religion, and even now philosophy, even in its own native soil, is that we're really just talking about the concrete totality, God, the whole, everything. And last time we talked about how Hegel's version of it was a lot more profound than what they tried to do in the past. So we gave an example of Anselm, how he tried to grasp the universal logic, but he wasn't clear enough to put it together, and his proof was easily refutable by Kant and others in history. But the way that Hegel talks about it makes it much more difficult to refute, because he went to the extremes on all the refutations. That's how he started getting to the sublations, right? So whether it's with the coherence theory of truth or the correspondence theory of truth, we say some pretty profound things that were confusing in the past, and it makes it unforgettable because we're talking about what is supposed to be the most supreme truth of all. But that kind of gets into today's session. Is we can talk about that. We can show how Hegel kind of did it, but is it practically useful? There's this distinction between theoretical spirit and practical spirit, where, philosophy is not in its right place. It's supposed to be a universal of all human knowledge, but it's not anymore. It's relegated down to this particular amongst physics, math, and the other sciences. It's supposed to be a limited domain. And this is because most of the research is not really practical in a lot of ways. There are some philosophers who are doing that, obviously, but the stereotype of philosophy today around the world is that it's just theoretical and it's a bunch of smart people talking to make themselves sound smart and feel good. And they stay in the ivory tower and they're afraid to get into politics, and nobody really finds them useful. So we can talk about this theory, and Hegel did this 200 years ago, and we're still, if he's so great, why isn't he changing the world now? It's because his theory couldn't even be grasped as theory, never mind bring it into practical spirit. But that's what we need to do to have a higher sense of recognition, to bring world spirit out. It is this process of recognition, as I talked about in the other sessions of spirit, is actually the squishy thing that is the whole point. Spirit is this super sensuous, intangible process that we're making determinate and tangible in the inner world. And I give you a remark from his history of philosophies and philosophies of history and his philosophy of right, about how nations, not just individuals, are fighting for this sort of recognition. This is kind of the supreme principle that makes us feel like we belong and that we're free. So we have to have this recognition process happen theoretically, but also practically if we're going to change the world in any significant way, to bring these new inspirational universals, these truths, into our material reality from this inner world, where at first they're only implicit, we're making them explicit. So we want the most universal recognition possible, because we want to skip this kind of step of colonialism. Well, we're not going to skip it. We've learned it. We sublated it. We're going to sublate this lesson we learned in colonialism and imperialism, which was the abstract negation working its way out in the state government kind of dialectic. We're going to obtain a universal recognition instead of a particular recognition, where we're vying amongst nations and they're warring with each other for that exact thing. People don't think that the material wars in reality are really for this squishy, intangible feeling of goodness. Oh, I'm recognized. You can get that from your mom. You don't need it from another nation. But that's actually what constitutions are doing. They're working, world spirit is working its way out through nations so that they recognize each other. But Hegel was critical of Kant's notion of something called the League of Nations, where we have kind of like the United Nations, we have particular nations getting around in a round table, and they discuss and they try and get to a universal consensus on how we should run the world economy. We get things that are kind of approximating this to, like the World Economic Forum or the Davos Forum, which is sort of seen as elitist and not really representing the people anymore, because wealth stratification is like at all-time highs and it's moving at an incredible rate globally in a way we've never actually seen before, because we've never had the technology funnel so much value to the top, and we've never had such a global universal reach. That doesn't mean that the people at either end, the top or the bottom or the middle, are terrible. We've already sublated that distinction, right? With the sublation of capitalism, communism, and socialism. We are trying to embrace everybody's infinitely valuable in this new world spirit, where everyone is essential. It's the system that needs to change. And so we're going to have this high level of recognition that is truly universal, so that Hegel's critique of this League of Nations model, which he said wouldn't work, isn't something that we reinvent. We're creating not a unity of particulars, we're creating a universal of members, of genuine living members in what he calls an identity. It's stronger than this loose particularity where he says you always need an external authority to kind of like dictate the caprice of all the nations, which we see today is leading to an inability to address the pandemic fairly. There's still hundreds of millions of people that won't even get a chance to get a vaccine, never mind debate it properly. And if you're against vaccines, it's just that the sharing of resources to get over the pandemic in a safe way and keep economies afloat in poor countries, they're like 50 years behind in some of these global studies. So what we're seeing right now in terms of world governance is not working as optimally as it could for billions of people. So the Nobel Prizes are a critical element of this process of recognition in our current epoch. All epochs of history had their own sort of bearers of the hegemonic structure, the norms of that kind of time. Ours is the Nobel Prizes. They're regarded as some of the highest prizes in the world. We will be trying to apply for other prizes, but this one is usually the most universally accepted around the world. But if there are more universal prizes, of course, we're open to sublating and improving. So we will apply for more. But this one is quite highly recognized. It's critical. People critique it, but it still has a kernel of integrity that people still recognize as representing the truth. And the truth, of course, is what genuine philosophy is after. So theoretically, we covered the proof of the ontological proof of God. Now what we're going to do is we're going to show it determinately in the sciences. So we did it logically yesterday in comparison with Anselm and the older proofs. Now we're going to actually do something a little bit different and take what we have today as modern science and show that it is this concrete totality and it operates by a universal logic. That's basically what the Nobel Prizes are trying to award for. Anytime you make a discovery at a very high level, it is this process of uncovering the absolute idea, what religion likes to call God, or the concrete whole, or the absolute idea, Plato's absolute idea, except in a living way that Plato couldn't grasp. That modern religions kind of did start grasping, but they did it in sensuous form. So Hegel's sublating them all, putting all the things they're missing, but keeping all the good stuff and putting it into the proper scientific mystical understanding. So are we really going to try and win all 5 Nobel Prizes? I thought we were only going to do, the Nobel Peace Prize. In the previous sessions, we were talking about Hegel and Frege and Boole and translating the science of logic into modern notation and then winning the Nobel Peace Prize, because this is how you sublate and kind of get in this living purpose of life that everybody can cohere in. But I think that all the sciences, according to Hegel's Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, they're all actually connected as one whole, which means that if we can figure out the logic, we can apply it to all the other sciences, which means that because no one else in the world has ever done this, because nobody's understood Hegel, it's going to be novel. And it's going to be very simple at first, but the simplicity is going to cut through thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of experiments and pages of peer-reviewed research that they're trying to use to approximate this clarity, this purity, this right order of things. And so if we apply it right, yes, we can win all 5 Nobel Prizes. Of course, this sounds incredible and ridiculous because people struggle their whole lives to just win 1 Nobel Prize. How are you going to win 5? What do you think? You're a genius? You're an egomaniac? A megalomaniac is what I've been called already a couple of times. Well, it's just a part of the process. And because I've been doing this for a long time, and people who have been trying to improve the world for a long time know that you get negated at first. It just always happens until you get into what Hegel calls a genuinely philosophical society, where an ideal philosopher's first reaction isn't always just abstract negation. It's also an immediate sublation. And this is where true science starts to become more blessed, more peaceful. But in the beginning, as where we are now, we are not in that society. We don't have that world spirit. So we are subjected to the Overton window and the dialectical language games that Wittgenstein kind of talks about. And the Overton window works that you have a certain level of narratives that you're allowed to express in the public consciousness or within the current hegemonic structure, the structure of power that's invisible and unquestioned. And of course, this Hegel stuff is way out of what is ordinary understanding. Even with cutting edge, like Nobel Prize research, even though the cutting edge of ordinary thinking, this is sublating that. And so the Overton window first has this process where you have to sort of break out of public opinion. And I'm giving this quote again that I covered in a previous session of Spirit when we were talking about the essence of existentialism. And it's just Hegel saying, to be independent of public opinion is the first formal condition of achieving anything great or rational, whether in life or in science. Great achievement is assured, however, of subsequent recognition and grateful acceptance by public opinion, which in due course will make it one of its own prejudices. So we're not just being inspirational speakers, Martin Luther King, all these types of things in the artistic world or in the political world. Science itself operates this way. When you make a new discovery, there's a lot of politics in the scientific enterprise, in academia, and it's actually slowing down the true abundance of what our species should be capable of at this point. But of course, we have to be weary and open to the true philosophical science, which means even though you might have the truth in the beginning and you win a Nobel Prize for it, the dialectic is going to act on it, and it's going to turn it into an opposite, and it's going to have further discoveries to go because it's constantly growing. And because we're genuine philosophers, we're prepared for that. Yes, we're going to break out of public opinion, but we're aware that we're going to become the new public opinion to then become our antithesis again. We are embracing the meta process with the results. And that's why this will be a new form of science that will be more peaceful than what is currently happening, with people having these ego battles and fighting to the death almost to support themselves in this enterprise of science, where they ridicule each other and call each other down, and they bond together in factions, and then the factions kind of have groupthink, and then you're supposed to, there's a bunch of stuff going on. But we are breaking out. And Gandhi says, you know, he kind of repeats the Overton window in a very short, profound saying, because he was quite dialectical, but he did it through the Indian philosophy. So this logic is universal. And because we were harping a little bit on, or Hegel was harping on Indian philosophy a lot in the past and saying Christianity was better, you know, it was just more explicit. But the truths were still present in an implicit form that was sensuous. And Gandhi was trying to modernize it in some ways. And so we're going to pay a little bit of respect because Hegel had limited access to older religions. So he says, first they ignore you, which is what's happening here. There's like only a couple of people in this Zoom chat, right? We've started to blast out the message to Cambridge. I think we've messaged 30 faculty members in the philosophy department at Cambridge. I messaged, I think, 40 grad students at Harvard. We just sent messages to, I think, a bunch of universities around the world. And they're all just ignoring, except for a couple are curious. And you can see them on academia, on my profiles. They're coming from Cambridge and searching and figuring out what's happening. But in the beginning, you get ignored, which is okay because it gives you some time to perfect your message or get it into a more ideal form. Then they laugh at you, of course. So now that people are starting to find out, the first reaction is you get laughed at, and you get called, well, you get called a bunch of things. A few people are making memes already. Then they fight you. So then now I'm being called an egomaniac. There's a really intense scholar who I got put in touch with, who's supposed to know Hegel very well. And so somebody heard enough of what I was saying, what these sessions were saying, to realize that it's grounded on something solid. So they were curious to see what would happen if I went up against one of the current authorities. And what's happening is that they laughed at first, and then I was able to sublate all the responses, like all of them, every single one, because Hegel's that comprehensive. Now they're taking it seriously and getting in and sort of feeling a little bit threatened. And I'm not there to be threatening, as long as I don't return the abstract negation, and none of our genuine philosophers who are in this movement fall into that trap. You're using the negations just to sublate. So you don't end up in that negative moment to reason. We know the logic, and it allows us to hold a love-centered core, compassion, because we're self-recognizing with the other, because that's the point. We're bringing people up with us. We're not falling into this abstract science, this finite science. We are performing infinite science, and we are embodying it as well. And so here's Gandhi sort of doing a version of this quite well. He says, they fight you, but then you win. And you win not violently, you win by sublation, by idealizing them and pulling the spirit out, which is possible if you're very clear yourself. This is now happening in practice. It's been a few months now. We have most of the sessions of spirit uploaded online. The views are starting to grow, and this process is going to pick up. So we're prepared for it though. Sublation is what's protecting us, because that's basically what every session before this was emphasizing. You can't lose that core, or you will fall into this trap. This is why we're going to make it through the Nobel Peace process. But you need to have a strategy, a winning strategy, to really have, to really do this properly and not be naive. And me practically, I have about 10, 12 years of organizing experience with philosophy. and I found a talk of a well-respected strategist at the business Harvard School, the old dean, and he gave a nice quick talk that was very dialectical about how you should carry out a winning plan. And he says, first of all, a plan is not a strategy. And we need to have a strategy if we're going to attain something so incredible like winning all 5 Nobel Prizes. And if we win all 5 Nobel Prizes, it will be what Kuhn, he was a philosopher of science, what he calls an exemplar in revolutionary science. You break out of ordinary science and you sublate into this revolution that changes the foundations. That's what Hegel's about to do to all the scientific enterprises across the world, not just for logic, but for physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, political theory, economics, everything. Basically, everything you can win a Nobel Prize for right now, Hegel's going to fundamentally sublate. So he's talking about a plan is not a strategy. A plan is just saying what you want to do, which is exactly what I'm saying here. I'm saying we're going to win these things, and here's some vague details. But he's saying a strategy is a integrative set of choices that positions you on the playing field of your choice in a way that you win. The key word here that made me put this presentation in this session was the word integrative. If you're not a genuine philosopher yet and you don't understand the universal logic, the science of logic that Hegel's giving us, then this word integrative looks normal. And it kind of sounds a little superficial, like synergy and all these business corporate terms that, you know, it sounds like a bunch of jargon while the managers are making millions of dollars to convince the the rest of the people to work outside of flow state, burn themselves out. And as some managers are not like that, but it's generally the stereotype that we're in this culture, and anxiety and depression are going up. But if you are a genuine philosopher, this word integrative is not an ordinary word. There's a profound logic here that it's approximating, and it is sublation. So he's talking about a sublated set of choices that positions you in a playing field of your choice. And the playing field of our choice is the realm of pure thought, corresponding to the realm of sensuous reality in every domain of human knowledge. Why? Because our domain of choice is the universal, which is genuine philosophy. We're taking the particular, the small, you know, feeble, impotent, egotistical, self-warring, self-conflicting version of abstract philosophy now, which does have wisdom in it, but we're going to supercharge that as its true essence, as the universal in all of the other domains. It is the logic applying itself inside of as the essence of all the other particular manifestations. So we have a chosen domain, a playing field, and we know what integration really means. It is what we are basing ourselves on, actually. The logic that we're talking about is the masterclass of sublation that Hegel gives us with over 200 categories in the science of logic. So he's saying something profound here. We are now aiming for a strategy. And if you look here, I give you a couple of examples of why this is so confusing and why people don't think this is a great thing. But universal sublation is often expressed with all these terms, but nobody really knows why they're all sounding the same. They have the same kind of essence in some way. There's something about them, and we now know what it is. It's sublation, but nobody in these modes can articulate with absolute clarity what it is, except for us now. And you can do the same thing for universal negation. These are all in the form of negation, but nobody in these modes can explain what the essence is that's uniting them. But we can, because we know the super sensuous logic underneath it. That's exactly what we're going to do to purify physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. We're just applying it to his video very quickly because our strategy needs to be wise. The second thing he says is that once you know that you have to have a strategy, it has to have internal coherence. So a strategic theory must be coherent and doable. And of course, we just talked about yesterday proving the existence of God ontologically using the coherence theory of proof primarily for the idea version of God or the concrete totality, and then the correspondence of it as universal laws in our world, what religion calls, or which Christianity calls, the works of God in the world. You can't perceive God in the world, you can only watch the acts. And so we take that atheistically as the laws of the universe, but we're taking them in a chopped up way, which is why we don't grasp the totality. But there are scientists now, and philosophers of science, realizing that all the separate domains are actually connected in this coherence. Our theories are becoming a theory of everything, and that theory of everything is coherent in itself. Our strategy too has to be coherent, and we're just emphasizing here that we know exactly what he's talking about because we are engaging with real logic. Before I move on to the next point though, I leave a comment here for some of our scholars who say that, no, I'm experiencing apophenia. I'm trying to find connections where there aren't any. This guy's talking about coherence. Hegel doesn't mention much about coherence anywhere in the Science of Logic or in the encyclopedia. And so it sounds like I'm just making this up because I have wishful thinking and I want this to be the way. But Hegel's a negative philosopher. He doesn't talk about all this wishy stuff. This is me and this new movement making things fit our model, not what Hegel really said. Well, here's some quotes of not only the man in the video, I think his name is Roger Martin. Roger Martin. Not only are they talking about coherence, like in this video clip here, they're talking about inner coherence, a more specialized version of coherence. So at 157, Roger talks about inner coherence himself directly. And then here's a quote from Hegel talking about inner coherence directly when he's sort of blasting Leibniz and Spinoza for not having this immanent coherence in their theories. So we know what they're talking about, and this is applicable to Hegel himself and what we're trying to do by bringing his philosophy into the world. So this is very profound. Roger Martin applying this kind of dialectical knowledge, even if he's not aware of it, to business and carrying out a strategy to achieve a plan. And we understand that. Why? Because his last recommendation is lay out the logic and then tweak it. What does this mean for us as genuine philosophers as we're pursuing the Nobel Prizes wisely? Well, not only are we going to lay out the logic the way he means, which is that you have to figure out who's going to do it, resources, buildings, timelines, figuring out the sensuous logic of it, but we are ourselves logicians in a universal sense. And we're mapping out the thing we're going to win the Nobel Peace Prize with and all these other prizes is logic. And we're laying out that logic as well in this kind of weird coherence. But then he's also saying, then tweak it. And we know what tweaking means. It just means the living spirit of true philosophical science, which is sublation. So he's talking about sublation and logic, which is what the whole point of the Sessions of Spirit are. And we need to embody this practically and understand this with the logic in order for us to achieve the goal wisely. So we will take your advice, Roger Martin. Let's get more practical into the details then. When we say living, especially if you're jumping into these sessions now, you might not know what we mean by living. You might be thinking, well, this doesn't apply to physics and chemistry and all this. Living is biological. So you might, if you're not crazy and out the window, absolute maniac, maybe you can get something in biology if you're going to apply this sublation to this weird model of logic, because the only thing that's really living in the world that's scientific and empirical are organisms. So you can't win the physics and the chemistry prize with this kind of logic, even if Hegel has some truth and you claim to understand it. But the way that we're talking about life here, living, is far, far more profound. And the only place you can kind of grasp it is in the old mystics of the past or in religious consciousness. But we usually dismiss those in modern science because there's no way to kind of prove it. But we are finding a way to prove it with this coherence model, that this universal living sublation is the pure thoughts themselves. So we're talking about this realm of pure thought, or the categories that we never think to question. We never think to question how we're organizing reality. We only ever think about correspondence. We have an object and our brains are subjectively interpreting it. The categories aren't in the object themselves, right? So we're saying, actually, Hegel's saying, yeah, actually these categories are in your head are actually objectively thinking themselves without you somewhere. And it's a somewhere that is a nowhere. It's that Buddhist kind of paradoxical. It's a spaceless, timeless realm of pure thought that is immanent in our current thought, and it is moving the sensuous material things in the universe invisibly because it is timeless and spaceless. It's what we're approximating in modern science as the universals of theory, of the laws of the universe that we know today. So if these categories are living and they derive, or everything else is derived from them, then we can say literally everything is living because it's all moving and growing in the sublative way. And where there's abstractions, that's not because of the idea, that's because of us and the irrationality of nature. What is truly actual though in this life is the idea. It is the concrete totality working in sublation, because the actual is rational and the rational is actual to Hegel. And I think that is what our scientists are starting to approximate. So don't get stuck in this trap where people are starting to say, well, you are these, ungrounded mystics that don't make any sense. Actually, this is perfectly logical. This is probably how the real logic is actually working, is by this universal kind of life. We're going to be proving and winning these Nobel Prizes theistically and atheistically at the same time. That's the hard part. Somebody might come and win the Nobel Prizes, maybe atheistically in modern science, and it's more acceptable. But what's even more profound than winning all 5 of them is winning all 5 of them in both those contradictory modes at the same time. This is like next level incredibleness that Hegel has given us. And I'm trying to give it a bridge into what we mean to get into the particulars of what we have to do in this strategy. You have to talk this way. And when you get negated, you have to be clear on these distinctions, or else you're gonna be made to look like you don't know what you're talking about, that you have a plan, but you don't have any realistic way of making it actionable because it's not coherent. This is the coherent way to talk about what life is between the supersensuous, physics, chemistry, biology, between all the prizes. That's how you talk about it between all the prizes. As we start talking to the committee in all the areas and the experts in all the areas, this is what we mean. And as we said in all the previous sessions of Spirit, sublation is literally the biggest thing missing. If there's only one thing we can teach, make it sublation. It is this concrete life in all domains of human knowledge. It's the life of genuine philosophy itself. I hope that makes sense. When we look at it genuinely philosophically, we grasp the concrete and clear absolute logic of what the mystics were always telling us in superstitious sensuous form in religious consciousness. The world is living, it is one organism, it is one syllogism. So now let's take this concept of life and let's make it even more determinate, more actionable, more detailed, so that people can understand us. And to take this life and put it into this universal form of reason is, of course, what we talked about before, the syllogism. Where we have to start to win all 5 is at the very, very top. There is a top to science. There's this nested structure that circles back on itself, but you have to get the highest level correct, or else everything else underneath it is going to be disordered fundamentally. So these are like the biggest scientific moves that we have to do and have to be absolutely clear on, or else the rest of the science, the rest of the philosophy is not going to make as much sense. It won't be as internally coherent. In itself, it makes sense in itself. You don't have to bring some kind of external interpretation, fandangle some things. Just thinking it through has this coherence that makes sense. Well, where do we start? Most people don't even think that there is a start to science, not a top or a bottom or anything. So already Hegel is starting to transcend our ordinary notions and clarity of science itself. He's bringing us from a finite, chopped up version of science to what he calls infinite science, which is this infinitely connected science that he calls genuine philosophy. But we have to think this for ourselves and have everybody on the Nobel team understanding this, because self-determination is incredibly important if we're going to have a chance at doing this practically. So here's how you understand this top level of science. It's called the absolute syllogism. And it is missing in the current scientific enterprise. It is missing in the Nobel Prize process. It looks like this. If you try to understand and categorize what Hegel has done, let's say you understand his categories. First of all, you might grasp that there's a syllogism happening, but it's the dead syllogism. So the dead syllogism is the one that's not in its right order. So order is incredibly important and has been a theme along with sublation through the entire Sessions of Spirit. You can only resolve contradictions in a concrete unity through ordering them correctly. That's how you resolve it. If you don't have the order, they're happening at the same time, they're conflated, they can't be separated, and they have these weird properties that don't make sense. And that's kind of what happens if you try and do the absolute syllogism in a dead way. So of course, a syllogism has three parts: a major premise, a minor premise, and then a conclusion. People say Hegel didn't use the triad. Yeah, he did use the triad. He just did it in this living way. So logic is one area, spirit is one area, nature is one area. So the sciences are actually operating in these categories, whether people realize it or not. This is how Hegel forms the top level categories. But this is the wrong order. So this is a dead syllogism. It actually won't make sense. The connections that Hegel gives us as one universal logic won't make sense in this order. It's dead. There's not a coherence that will keep building itself infinitely. You're going to get to an abstraction that doesn't make sense. Here's the second form of the absolute syllogism. It also doesn't make sense because it's also not in the right order. There's a third version, also not in the right order. What is the, well, not only is the order important, but the connection that they're connected at all is important. So here's a version of the unconnected domains. They're just existing by themselves, which is kind of how science is operating now in their silos. This is also the most dead of all, because not only are they in the wrong order, but they're not even connected to each other, between each other. So this is the wrong way that science is kind of going about it, which is why they haven't approximated what Hegel has done from the top to the bottom of all domains of human knowledge. So what is the living way? Well, Hegel gives it to us. The living way to think about the highest level of science that make sure that all the rest of the logic is coherent, so we can win the Nobel Prize across all of them, is this order: logic, nature, spirit. So without this order, it's easy to fall into these traps, and hundreds and thousands of philosophers and scientists and theologians have fallen into this trap before. So it looks so simple, but this is taking thousands and thousands of years to purify itself. Thousands of, we're getting this incredible gift from Hegel that is hard to appreciate, because if you haven't done the work yourself, you're just being given the answer. Of course, it's hard to appreciate something that you haven't thought through yourself. But for those who are in the Nobel Prize Committee, they will be able to appreciate and recognize this, because they have been in these domains for thousands of hours, for the decades of their lives. They've dedicated themselves to the goodness of science. So this is the right order. And of course, we know from the rest of the sessions that the true profoundness is that there's a couple of different ways to do it. You can rotate the syllogism, and it's still true. That's part of the life, is not only the right order, but you can rotate it on this circle of reason where it completes itself, and it's still consistent and coherent. That's why we could sublate atheism with theism. That's why all these contradictions make sense to us now. And you can see here me rotating the circles. So this is the right way to think about the top level of science. And if we don't have this clear, you can't win the Nobel Prizes. There's no way. The strategy isn't coherent enough. So we have to begin with this. And then we're going to break it down into a bunch of smaller steps. But everybody in the Nobel Prize Committee has to grasp this. And if it sounds like I'm making this up, I give you some more, for our Hegel scholars, I give some more quotes of where Hegel, in the last section of his entire encyclopedia, after he goes through thousands and thousands of pages of exploration, in the final 3 paragraphs, he talks about the absolute syllogism in these 3 ways. So we are talking straight Hegel here, which is why it's going to be academic. It's going to be easy for us to be academic about this, even though my presentation of it is sublating mysticism and religion, which we're staying with the rigor. The most concrete and alive syllogism of all, the most absolutely alive syllogism of all, though, is this 4th one, where not only do you have the right order, not only can you rotate it, not only are they connected, but you yourself are part of the process. You are the most concrete thing of all. It's all in you. And we're all small finite versions doing this, which we talked about as concrete God, apotheosis, theopoiosis, absolute spirit, absolute Ubermensch, all that kind of stuff. So very high standard here. And it has to start there as part of the strategy. This is not what has happened with previous philosophers who had great minds. And here's a paragraph of Hegel blasting Leibniz and Spinoza, where, Einstein said his God, Einstein said his version of God, because he was a mystical scientist. He was close to the dialectical logic in a lot of ways, which is why he won Nobel Prizes, right? He got nominated because, or a Nobel Prize, because he broke out of ordinary understanding. And he said, if there was a God, it was the God of Spinoza. And he was Jewish, and Spinoza was Jewish. There's a lot of politics going on at the time. But here's Hegel transcending Einstein's God then, and saying, well, actually, Einstein's God is flawed, and so is Leibniz, who came after. And he gives us a great example of how this syllogism, this living syllogism, as the topmost categories of the pure thoughts thinking themselves, is what was missing. That internal coherence was missing in Leibniz and Spinoza. It has to be internally coherent. Leibniz and Spinoza were taking the pure thought categories and applying them and kind of figuring things out as these universals. But they were doing it from outside and taking the categories as axiomatic, which we said was just revelation. It wasn't this infinite science that circled back and justified every single proposition, every single assumption. They didn't do that. So that's why he's saying it's an external dogmatic reflection. We're not doing that. We're starting from the top and we're circling back around to justify the top with the bottom. So this is why it's really, really profound. Nobody has done this before. So this is a good example of our strategies more concrete than these previous philosophers, but it's because we're sublating them. We're actually taking what they did right, and we're standing on their shoulders, and we're moving in that direction, which is why it's an ode to them, even though we know their limit. So here's what the living syllogism looks like. Let's unpack it in even more detail. Let's make our plan more concrete. The syllogism, yes, has this form, but it also has a form of its own. The syllogism grows its own self. So the first type of syllogism is the syllogism of existence. It's like an immediate kind of syllogism. The second type is the syllogism of reflection, where the categories are more developed, more concrete, but still has this element of externality to them. And then there's the syllogism of the notion, which is where they're complete. They have the universal, particular, and the individual in their proper order in this logical syllogistic process. So it's a syllogism of syllogisms. And Hegel gives us an even more particular, refined version of how to think about these in three concrete steps. So the first is the syllogism of existence grows itself into four other kinds. And you can see it here. The elements of the notion are just being rotated, and they're being rotated in their proper living order. So Hegel's rotating first particular, individual, universal. Actually, it's supposed to be individual, particular, universal. And then the second one is particular, individual, universal. And then the next one is individual, universal, particular. And the last one is universal, 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 which he said was missing completely in human knowledge. Aristotle kind of did a version of some of these, and the scholastics kind of did a version of some of these, but no one has ever done the fourth. And he only grasped that because he was thinking so clearly from the top down. All of this is growing. These aren't separate. This one finishes itself, sublates itself into this one, into this one, into this is growing downwards, and then it jumps into this category and starts growing again. So we're growing this way and we're growing crossways. So we're growing in one organism. Then we get the second type of syllogisms building on the first ones as the syllogism of allness, the syllogism of induction, the syllogism of analogy. And then that finishes its development as the syllogism of reflection. And then we get the third most complete one of all, which is that it's building on all previous forms of syllogism into the syllogism of necessity, the syllogism of the notion, which has the categorical syllogism, the hypothetical syllogism, and the disjunctive syllogism. And I'm not going to go into incredible detail into each one of these because that's where the Nobel Prize is. And the logicians around the world who recognize the living version of this will start to build these details. But this is going to result in the object of our strategy, which is that we're going to win these Nobel Prizes by showing these syllogisms in physics, in chemistry, in medicine, in literature, and in peace as the logic. Those are the details of the concrete strategy that we have to figure out. And we have a really strong outline of how to do that with Hegel. Now we're just going to go in and find where modern science is at and start plugging in and making the connections that they are missing and using Hegel's philosophy of nature to kind of do the big leaps and correcting Hegel by some of our modern leaps because Hegel was limited by his time. But I think he got the big leaps right, and that's what's missing. So this is how we're organizing science today, or at least how the Nobel Prize Committee organizes things. It's not organizing them in the syllogism, but it does notice a pattern. The smartest people in the world are inherently dialectically aware in some way, at least intuitively, to the recognizing that there is a progress happening. And you have physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace, and then economics. And normally how people sum this up is they just say, well, they're increasing in complexity. Now, at least we know in modern science that they're not completely separate. There is transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary science going on, where we have biophysics and chemical medicine or chemical biology, and they're starting to get threaded together. But usually physics is the most foundational, then it turns into chemistry, and then it kind of is applied to biology and medicine, and then it kind of turns into psychology and then culture, and that's where literature comes in. And then a peaceful culture is the most developed culture of all, so it's kind of like a hyper version of the literature stuff. And then you get constitutions and states that are supposed to be more peaceful, and you get economics and politics and all that kind of stuff. We're just ordering these categories now in the same order Hegel did 200 years ago, but he did it in that living form. So these are still kind of abstract, even though we're implicitly approximating some kind of right order to it, right? But nobody can really articulate what that order is. What's the essence of it? That's what we're going to fix. Here's the order. Here's a couple of particular details I give you to get you excited. Hegel talks a lot about gravity and stuff like that. I discovered that the Planck length of universal logic, like the smallest unit, is the abstract negation, which people who have followed these talks by now might understand what I mean by that. There's an audio recording of me first discovering it, but that's the kind of level that we're going to be operating in, even the most basic category. But all the categories will have these particulars in this kind of order, but we're going to make the order explicit too, not just the details inside of each area. The living way to think about it is to organize these categories in terms of that absolute syllogism. And people aren't clear enough to organize them. But look at logic, nature, spirit has the Nobel Peace Prize in the logic, because the logic is what influences culture. And if your logic is ideal, then your culture will be ideal. So we will win the Nobel Peace Prize by mastering the logic in ourselves and then showing how that applies to culture. Nobody ever thinks to do this. Maybe some people do in an abstract form, but we're very clear on what we're doing here and why it's in this order. The next one is, of course, is nature. Then we have the more ordinary, physics, chemistry, medicine makes kind of sense. We know this through evolution now. We don't think about it in terms of the divine evolution of the supersensuous world coming through, like creationists want to believe, but we're doing both. We're saying they're both happening. Darwinian evolution is happening in this random contingency of infinite existential angst, but we're also doing it in this sort of beautiful supersensuous way where it's the logic and the idea coming through. That's what rationality is. And then, of course, spirit is where the literature prize is, where we have art trying to approximate the logic in a sensuous form, and culture belongs here. This is the right way to sort of think about it. And when we break all of these apart, and there are many, many, many departments, thousands of departments, we can very quickly organize them and do this not just for the top level, but apply the living syllogism and find where it is in each one of these areas, and then in each one of the subdepartments, and then each one of the phenomena, and then in each one of the experiments. And people can say, okay, this sounds great in some kind of, you're just making a plan. There's still not enough detail here to really make it sound like, you're talking about unpacking all these, departments that the Nobel Prize gives prizes for. You're talking about you doing it, but you haven't done it yet. You haven't demonstrated that this is actually practically going to work. Your strategy is still just a plan. Well, no. We actually have gone into one of the areas, and we're prepared that even the process itself, once we do have the details, we're prepared that it's still going to go through the syllogistic process where we have the theory developed with Hegel. He was the principal, and we're building our core team to kind of bring it to the world. This is all good and peaceful, but this is just the first moment of logic. This is the abstract understanding when it's by itself. Then, of course, you try and bring it into the world, and the dialectical moment starts up, and it's the negative moment of reason, where we just get blasted by abstract negations because our culture is not that concrete. So, of course, the limit of our reason is the limit of our fun, flow, and games. And we're going to be blasted to death, hopefully not to death. We're going to sublate it with the Nobel Prize Committee, but almost all of society. But we're okay with that because we know that we embodied the sublation, and we're going to take those abstract negations and not fall into the trap. We're going to then, once we address all the concerns, we're then going to experience the sublation. So what I think that's going to happen first is with the logic itself, because Hegel is so clear in the logic. His philosophy of nature and his philosophy of psychology are a little bit more contingent to his time. So there's some limits there, but the logic is eternal. The logic is a lot more supersensuous. It's not dependent on time. So what he did there is probably a lot more applicable to any time zone, including ours or epoch. And you can see with the synchronicity document of philosophies, we've already got a very strong start on the details. So this is what the details look like. These are all, every category here of Hegel, these are all in syllogistic order. I put it in linear order here, but we can cite the passages and show that these are all moving by syllogisms and syllogisms and syllogisms. It's what Hegel calls the tripartite structure of the syllogism. So of course, what we're doing is we're just translating it into modern notation. So we did it with Boole's notation, we're doing it with Peirce's notation, and we're going all the way through the categories and showing that actually this is what Hegel's doing logically. And I think the logicians of the world will pick up on this and start to confirm and recognize that we really do deserve a Nobel Peace Prize for this. Never mind the rest of it. So once this starts getting people excited, this logic is what's underpinning all these other prizes. So once we get acknowledgement for this one and we show the syllogisms and all the others, this is sort of the proof of the application. So it sounds a little bit strange, but to the people who understand these, how precise these logics are, they will say, I don't fully understand what's going on. I've never seen this before, but it does make some sense that Hegel's beginning with the universal. Pure being is the universal. There's no particularity there. Modern logic always assumes that logic has to have an object to apply the logic to in some way. And we're saying, no, not only do the objects not have to exist sensuously, but the principles themselves are broken down. The axioms themselves can be broken down, and we can find the true presuppositionless beginnings of logic. And then we can rebuild the abstract logic. We can rebuild the axioms that current logic is taking for granted as true by these more simpler ones. And then we can complete the whole system by going all the way to the objects and then applying that logic to the objects like normal logic. We're just completing the whole loop, which is exactly what logicians want to do. So they're a little bit hypocritical right now, Hegel says, because they claim to be, operating presuppositionlessly, no mystical, no nothing, no imagination. Yet the rules that they're using are not justified themselves. And so we're going to come in and be more logical than a logician in this kind of mystical way that will make sense to them. So there's some very practical strategic details across all of history. This is also a historical document. So we're doing many things all at once here. That's hard for ordinary consciousness to grasp how amazing this is at first. But as people start to warm up to it and they start to recognize, and the Nobel Prize Committee will start to recognize it too, because they're very high level, right? That's when people will take it seriously and they stop laughing and they start to realize that not only are we winning, but they're winning too, because we're not out to abstractly negate the foundations of science. We're out to sublate in this new living spirit. This stuff already kind of exists in the world. We are applying syllogisms, but it's not something that's subjective. That's what modern science thinks it is. This is the Kantian perspective. We've already shown with Wittgenstein and the metaphysics that Hegel says, no, this stuff is already happening. We're just realizing it. So when we win these Nobel Prizes, we're actually experiencing a return to how the universe really is, which is a lot more rational than we give it credit for, because we're not that rational yet. Our philosophies aren't that wise. So the whole point of this is once we gain this true universal wisdom, what's the point? We've already talked about the purpose of life. The point is to flow with each other and liberate each other in this higher genuine freedom, which is for the greatest benefit of humankind. That's why these Nobel Prizes are a great source of recognition, because it protects us in terms of the absolute idea, which is automatically good in itself. Remember, evil is just ignorance. And so by overcoming this with this more concrete science, we are actually entering the good and the true universal sense that Alfred Nobel wanted his funds and his legacy to represent. And that's why it's a great place to introduce not just God on earth, but to welcome the absolute on earth, which is also the secular version of God, or the concrete theory of everything, the living theory. Okay, I hope you guys found that interesting. More details to come, of course, but if you are energized in your practical spirit and this is calling out to you, we're creating a peaceful revolution. If you have questions, negations, sublations, if you don't believe us, if you do, everything is a part of this genuine philosophy. Critical thinking is a necessary moment. So please feel free to question us on Hegelians who want to change the world. If you want to join the actual team, the Nobel Prize team, you'll have to take the wisdom quiz, because abstract negations have to be sublated as part of the process of science itself to make it more truthful, to make our cognitive biases and our cultural baggage and all the trauma we have not taint the science or the genuine philosophy. Once we have that clarity, we can go into any philosophy and start sublating, not just the areas of the Nobel Peace Prizes. We can go into any other philosophy or religion and start clarifying it. We can do this with technologies themselves. So once we win the Nobel Prize, we're going to have a whole bunch of social credit or credibility to go and talk to these companies and say, hey, look, the world wants you to use these technologies in this way, or we just start the labs ourselves. Because when you win the Nobel Prizes, the best in the world flock to you and they say, we want to work for a higher purpose. We don't care about the money. They have the spirit glowing in their hearts, whether religious or just good atheistic secularists. They want to use their talents on earth for something greater. And so they will gravitate to us through these Nobel Prizes as a recognition that we are doing the right thing in the right order, especially with CRISPR, because that's moving very quickly, which is why we want to try and win these prizes next year and get nominated by January 28th, which is, I guess, one of the most strategic details of all. So 16 is that we're going to do this interpersonally in a much better way, a much more idealistic way. We're going to figure out who wants to sublate first with these universal surveys of wisdom, then demonstrate how to sublate as kind of like a spectator sport online and make science a public open science forum. Those are all the channels that I'm using to do that. If you want to send somebody, of course, the state itself is going to be based on this. So we don't have a global, concrete, universal spirit. We just have this League of Nations kind of thing that's warring and in stalemate right now, which is exactly what Hegel predicted. So this new identity is going to be based on this new science, based on this universal form of reason, which is the syllogism in its living form. We're going to apply this not as a negation of the old biblical texts. We're going to find this infinite science in them to find the essence of God in a mega Bible study, mega Quran study, Tripitaka, all of them. And these are where the studies are performing, where we're lining up the passages. We're not changing the passages. We're just changing the order into this order of the science of logic. And then, of course, we're going to be advertising this around the world as a new truth medium. So we're going to be explaining our details. We're not going to be using paywalls or anything. This philosophy is universal. It's supposed to be given to the world for free. And then we satisfy our needs through the process in a different kind of way, where we approximate flow state and we meet people's needs where they are. So we'll be broadcasting all our progress as we go along in our strategy, so people can join our strategy at certain points and be very clear about it. I'm restreaming my Twitch stream across 6 different platforms right now as we speak. And of course, the last step is once you pass the wisdom quiz and you kind of go through the orientation and you understand how to sublate, then you can actually join the team and work on the area of your expertise. If you're a PhD, if you're a street cleaner, if you're a kid, doesn't matter what your dialectics are, we're going to sublate everybody, because this is the kind of infinite science where everybody belongs. So thank you guys for listening to that and joining in, whether theoretically or practically. Tomorrow or the next section, we're going to talk about the last step, which is probably the most important step of all, and that's carrying this all out together in a practical new spirit that has a strong strategy. So thank you guys, keep sublating and stay free.